fall seminar. I'm Dennis Ojima. And this is being co-hosted with the Ecosystem Science and Sustainability Department, the Natural Resource Ecology Lab, and the North Central Climate Science Center. And for those of you who come regularly to these seminars, we're going to try to have our sort of coffee social half an hour before the seminars in the Climate Science Center break room, and if the weather's like today, on the deck. And so we had that. Brad was there, kind of catching up with him before the seminar. It's really a pleasure to introduce Brad. I've known Brad for quite a few years, and he's internationally known for his work in sort of climate change and water resource world, and especially with what's happening in the western part of the United States and on the Colorado River. Currently, he's a senior scholar, research scientist with the Colorado Water Institute here on campus. And then recently, prior to that, spent 12, 15 years University of Colorado, where initially director of the Western Water Assessment of the NOAA RESA, as well, most recently, with the Gretchen Wilkinson School for Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment. And so we really come, and for Brad is sort of coming home, coming back to CSU, because he actually received his MBA here in 1990 sometime. And so it's really a pleasure to have Brad actually on campus working with us, working with the Climate Hub and working with the Climate Science Centers. So turn it over to you.
So I'm curious, how many of you feel like you know something reasonable about the Colorado River before I start? So not many of you. Any water hydrology kind of people that want to admit to that? All right, I'm just trying to figure out what kind of level to pitch this talk. I'm going to go, I think, for about 40 minutes, and you all are welcome to interrupt me. I always love interruptions because mostly you wake up your neighbor and you make them pay attention. So if you want to just blurt something out like, where did that come from, or I don't understand, or stop, please do. I know that takes a little bit of extroversion to do it, but it's actually good. So I'm going to talk about what is called Colorado River Drought Contingency Planning. And notice it's not climate change planning, it's drought contingency planning. And there are versions of this going on in both the Upper Basin, which I'll describe in a second, and the Lower Basin. This talk is mostly about the Lower Basin because I would argue it's further along. This paper actually comes from 2007, and Tim Barnett and David Pierce at the time. All right. Don't think I want to restart the computer, install updates, right? In 2007, they came out with this paper that suggested Lake Mead had a 50% chance of going dry by 2021 due to climate change and overuse. And it really woke people up. In fact, it really irritated the water management community. I heard of one phone call amongst water managers in California where the call went something like this: who funds Scripps Institute and can we cut their funding? because of this article. But it really enforced a whole bunch of work, a follow-on to look at how true might this be. And shockingly, this paper was actually pretty well done, and I would argue maybe the 50% dry by 2021 was an overstatement, but the overall consensus that there was a problem in the Colorado River was right on. And that's, in some sense, what this talk is all about. Course. There we go. So just a quick, I'm going to talk, here's my outline, a whole bunch of background on the river and the basin. I'm going to talk about the current and future drought and basically who's going to pay for this drought in terms of water. There's a whole bunch of science issues here on temperatures and modeling a mega drought, and then finally some ag solutions and municipal solutions at the end. So from 1930 through 2014, here's an image of the two largest reservoirs in the United States. They're stacked up back to back, Lake Powell, Lake Mead. You can see Lake Mead fills there in the 1930s. Lake Powell comes online and fills. You have a little drought in the mid-90s. And then you come into the year 2000s, and we're now at about 40% total capacity. And there were two big 15-year droughts in this period, one in the 1950s, all called precipitation dominated, and then one in the 2000s, all called temperature dominated. But this is what has really driven the discussion, this huge decline in flows, and it's gotten national attention. I always like to say, when the New York Times is covering a Western water issue, it's a big deal. And Michael Wines here wrote this article in 2014. He's written, I think, at least 2 and maybe 3 articles. Talks about the drought, talks about low levels in Lake Mead, that the first shortages ever in the system are likely to occur at some point in the future. Mentions climate change, supply and demand gap, losses in power potentially, these enormous threats to the Central Arizona Project in Arizona, which I'll go into some depth on. Potentially desal is a small option to help solve some of these problems, and then conservation. Little basic background here on the basin. So 7 states, 2 nations. Annual flow, and I'm going to speak million acre feet, so 16.4 million acre feet. Denver's water system, to give you an idea, if you max it out, can deliver about 300,000 acre feet in a year. Lake Dillon is about 200,000 acre feet. 16 million acre feet, it's a lot of water. 40 million people, every major city in the American Southwest gets water out of this river, if it's in the basin or not. And all these arrows show you where water goes. I mean, water actually ends up in Cheyenne through a complicated exchange. Colorado River water, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, into Los Angeles, uphill into Arizona via the Central Arizona Project. Las Vegas, 90% of their water comes out of the river. Half of our water here on the Front Range comes out of this system. So it is a big deal if it doesn't have enough water in it. And there's an enormous complex set of agreements around this that we call the law of the river. And the basic allocation is that the Upper Basin here gets 50%, the Lower Basin here gets 50%. But the Upper Basin has what some people term a delivery requirement to the Lower Basin, and what it really means is the Upper Basin gets hydrologic leftovers. The Lower Basin has a more secure water supply. And the dividing line between the Upper Basin is Lee's Ferry, and I always kind of have fun to point out that my great-great-grandfather was John D. Lee, the guy who founded that place. Lee had 21 wives. He probably has 800,000 descendants. It's actually not that hard to be related to John D. Lee. So I mentioned some of the stressors. This is an image that came out in 2012 that finally showed demand there in red and supply in blue finally crossing, and it doesn't matter how big your reservoirs are, you can't have that for very long, right? And just all the kinds of things that are going on and potentially going on, and most of these I'll cover at some point in time. So this is the problem in the Lower Basin. The 3 Lower Basin states are Arizona, California, Nevada, and what they have has been termed is called a structural deficit. And it has nothing to do with concrete or structures. It has to do with a setting in law and policy that basically makes them use more water than water to which they actually have a legal right. And the reason they can do this is that the Upper Basin actually isn't using its full supply. And so this 1922 Colorado River Compact that allocated out the waters allows the Lower Basin to utilize more water than they have. But they can only do that so long as climate change doesn't push the flows down or the Upper Basin doesn't decide to use more water. And here's the mathematics of the structural deficit. 9 million flows into Mead from Lake Powell. They let out 9.6 and they lose 0.6. And this 9.6 goes to Arizona, California, Nevada, and to Mexico. And the net balance on this is 1.2 million acre feet. It's a negative net balance. Well, you can't run this very long, right, without some kind of balancing. And what has happened historically is the Upper Basin gets extra water stored in Powell that they're not using, and they do what's called an equalization release, and it runs down into Mead. This only came about in about 1994 when the Central Arizona Project finally came online. And just a little more history here. So in 1968, the state of Arizona got this act passed that gave them federal funding for the Central Arizona Project. And it was a project that they had long desired because they needed federal funding to fully utilize their Colorado River allocation in the state. To get water into the main part of Arizona, you got to pump it uphill from the river into Phoenix and Tucson, and I'll show you an alignment in a second. And so in 1968, after a Supreme Court battle to allocate the river that was settled in 1964, Arizona finally got this. But the price they paid in the Congress was an agreement that this supply would be junior to California's water use, that it would be junior in perpetuity. And what's another little family history piece, and I'll stop on the family history here. This is Lyndon Johnson signing this. There's one woman in this room, 1968. We've come a long ways, right? A bunch of middle-aged white guys. And two of these people are my relatives, actually.
Sir, do you know who the woman is?
That's Lady Bird Johnson. That's the president's wife. Yeah. Two of these folks are my relatives. This is my father, who was in the U.S. House at the time and was instrumental in getting this law passed. And then my uncle Stuart here was Secretary of the Interior at the time, too, and also involved in making this deal work. But in 1968, they knew they had a long-term problem. They knew this would not work. And the question was, when would it not work? Would it be 2000? Would it be 2030? When would it be? And so they put in place this basic ticking time bomb that we're now dealing with. And of course, nobody had any idea about climate change. So what did that law do? It put in place the financing to build the Central Arizona Project. And $4 billion project. It runs something like 300 plus miles from the Colorado River there on the left up to Phoenix and into Tucson. It pumps water uphill almost 3,000 vertical feet, uses about 400 megawatts of power. Something called the Navajo Generating Station on the shores of Lake Powell supply water. And in an odd twist of fate, just all these decisions come back to haunt us. They decided to build and power this through this Navajo power plant, a coal-fired power plant, because they didn't want to put dams in the Grand Canyon, which was a horrible idea. And the original idea was to put all these dams in the Grand Canyon, get hydropower and power it. Well, at the time, they thought Navajo Generating Station was a better environmental outcome. And we now know today that coal-fired power plants aren't such a great thing. There's a lot of other history. I'd give a whole talk on that generating station, but it's just sort of an interesting twist of fate. So this is what Arizona relies on. Half their Colorado River water supplies, more than half, actually ends up all the way somewhere along, mostly in Phoenix and mostly in Tucson, a lot of agriculture.
Do you have any idea about the amount of water that's evaporated out of those ditches?
The big canal, they know the number. You know, there's been various talk about trying to cover it with solar panels, whatever. At this point in time, they don't think it's a cost-effective thing to do. At some point, they may. You know, in Lake Mead, you saw the number, 600,000 acre feet, far greater surface area than the surface area of that canal. I don't know what the number would be. It's probably 100,000 acre feet or 200,000. I mean, it's a significant amount, but is it cost effective to do something about it? It may be at some point, given what's going on. So I showed you earlier that image of the two reservoirs combined in their storage. This is just Lake Mead since 2000. And you can see that structural deficit line, right? You can see an equalization release when we had a really big year, and Powell actually got some more water, and then it continues to decline. And there are 3 levels in Lake Mead that are problematic, because in 2007, the states agreed that if Lake Mead hit 1075, they trigger a first level shortage, which would almost all fall on Arizona, because that 1968 act. At 1050, a more severe shortage, and then finally at 1025, yet another one. Problem with the 2007 agreement is only dealt with half that structural deficit, not the complete amount. And so you still got a big problem hanging out there to solve. And you can kind of see the levels here at 1025. I mean, you only have 21% of Lake Mead sitting in the reservoir. At 1,000, only 16%. And, you know, when they agreed to this in 2007, they sort of had, we'll consult at 1025 to solve the problem. Well, that sounds nice if you can kind of plan on this nice little decline. But frankly, at the time it was signed, and still to this day, a city of 2 million people, Las Vegas, can't get water out of the reservoir below 1,000 feet. So you can't let this reservoir get anywhere near 1025. You just can't do it. You have way too many people dependent upon it.
That's because the intake for that diversion is at that level.
It's at that level in the lake. And Las Vegas over the last 10 years has spent $1.5 billion to put a new intake into the bottom of the reservoir. And that thing will fully come online in the next 3 or 4 years. They've done it in pieces. And $1.5 billion is kind of a lot of money. So these are just the kind of shortage amounts in those Lake Mead levels. Let's see if there's anything else in here that's really interesting. You know, if you look at 1025 Arizona, that's 500,000 acre feet roughly of shortage. The total amount in that canal is 1.5 million. So 30% of that canal would be dried up. And that has all kinds of impacts on the state of Arizona, as you might imagine. Some of which they can handle for sure. We can all handle some shortages, but 30% is a fair bit and it causes problems. Reclamation, a big manager of this system in the Lower Basin, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, issues these forecasts on what reservoir levels are going to be in what's called the 24-month study. And these are just from this year, August 2016. And I'll just focus you on shortage condition, any amount, Mead less than 1075. And the years here. So these are percent. So in 2018, they're saying there's a 48% chance of any kind of shortage, roughly 60% going forward. And these level 3 shortages are, 3 and 7%, the most serious kinds. That, if you're a water manager, you want to see a 1% chance or less. You don't want to see 3 and 7 or, in these double digits. So I mentioned earlier the notion of these 2 droughts, right? The 1950s drought that was precipitation driven, and then this 2000 drought that's temperature driven. And you can see natural flows in the upper image here, the annual in the light colors, and then this trend line, linear trend and a smooth trend. And here's the 1950s drought, almost a 20% decline in flow. Same thing out here, close to 20% decline. But I want to point your look at this. So this is precipitation, a lot of annual variability. 1950s, this big decline, about 9% decline, translates into about twice that in terms of runoff, about 18%, 20% decline. Over here in the 2000s, not nearly the same precipitation decline. This is not a precipitation-driven drought. So what is it? All right, we'll get back to that, right? You know the answer. We would already be in shortage in the basin right now were it not for 2 unbelievable Mays. And they looked almost identical. So in May 2015, May 1, the forecast that are pretty good based on snowmelt was for 74% of runoff into the system. If we'd actually gotten that, we'd have a shortage right now in the system. What happened instead was the wettest May in U.S. history. Wettest May in U.S. history. And the forecast or the actual inflow showed up at about 95% of normal. So in 6 weeks, we got 20% of additional runoff. Same thing happened this year, just almost identical. We didn't have the wettest May, but the forecast was at low 70s and it went to mid 90s. 2 very unusual years stacked back to back. And that's what's kept these guys out of shortage. So I left you hanging there. Why this decline in runoff? And the answer is temperature. So just like everywhere, throughout the West and throughout the world, you're seeing between 1.5 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit, close to 1 degree Celsius, even more, above the 20th century average. And so here's the Upper Basin temperatures, which generates 85% of the runoff in the basin. So above Lee's Ferry there, 85%, almost all snow melt. Well, actually not almost all, but predominantly snow melt. You see annual data, again, trend lines of various kinds. And there's some really easy science you can do that says somewhere between 1/6 and 1/2 of the decline is due to these increased temperatures. And that does not bode well for the future, right? because we know it's going to get a lot warmer. 4 Fahrenheit probably by 2050, maybe 7 Fahrenheit by 2100, depending on exactly how much carbon we decide to burn. And why is temperature such a big influence? Because you get higher evaporation, you get a greater atmospheric moisture suck or demand, you get longer snow-free periods, the area greens up and can grow for longer. That's why you get the decline in flows based on additional temperatures. So here's all 4 of those together, and you can just kind of see how all this matches up here, and it doesn't look great for the future. And decision makers know this. I mean, so I started giving climate change talks in 2003 to water managers, pretty much the dirty looks. I can remember it well. They now accept this as a real risk and something to be managed for in the American West. But they also have all these other pressures on them to deal with this issue. And so climate change gets talked about a lot, but it's not the sole reason for the actions, these drought contingency plans that are underway. All right, so that's all in the way of background. And now I want to move into who gets shorted here and what are some of these impacts. And I mentioned earlier this 2007 agreement where they first decided what they were going to do about the lower basin and the structural deficit, how they were going to allocate that out, the 1968 law that forces Arizona to take the lion's share of it. And so I mentioned these reservoir levels, right? 1075 in Mead, 1050 here, and then the 1025. And this is what happened in 2007. You get Arizona and Nevada taking pieces of this gray area here. And again, it goes out to about 600,000 acre feet, half of the 1.2 million. And just this year, they've announced this new plan, this proposed drought contingency plan. And notice who's a part of it: Arizona, Nevada. US is going to take a small part. California is going to step up and take a part, even though legally they don't have to. I would argue politically and sort of policy-wise, they have got to, because you cannot dry up the Central Arizona Project Canal. And that's 1.2 million acre feet. It would come very close to drying the canal. You could run an extra 300,000 in the canal. They probably wouldn't even run it. I've never heard them say, but they probably wouldn't even run the thing. Probably wouldn't be. And I'll show you one of the reasons why here in a second. So here's what happened in 2007 in this agreement with Mexico. Mexico's actually part of the picture too, because we deliver 1.5 million acre feet to them via treaty, so they get 10% of the river. And again, the levels in the lake, you see Arizona taking most of it. Nevada's this tiny little blue sliver here, and then Mexico's the green. And that's how you get out to 600,000. And that's kind of the same thing. These different levels, and Mexico's contribution, Nevada's, Arizona's, nothing new here, just a tabular format of what I just showed you. So here's what happens within Arizona. Here's their total water that goes through that Central Arizona Project Canal, and they have higher priorities at the bottom of this and lower priorities at the bottom. They've got a little bit of the highest. They've got some Indian water and some M&I, municipal and industrial water. And then they so-called non-Indian ag pool, and then these others. And here's what happens if you get to that first level of shortage. You come down from the top, and they can kind of handle this. Some of this water, they've, believe it or not, been storing in the ground in Arizona, so it's not totally critical for them. But by the time you get down into here, you actually start to do real damage. Here's another look at kind of this newer agreement. That's probably going to need a federal EIS, which is obviously a complicated and lengthy process, but they're trying to rush this through. And so you've got, Arizona again taking the lion's share. That's almost half their cap canal right there. You got California. Notice everybody has agreed to take shortages sooner, right? They're going to take them sooner at 1090 here, not 1075. And then as they drop down to 1045, California gets into the game here. And this, who knows exactly where this will come out of? Probably California ag users. The single largest diverter in the United States is on the Colorado River. It's called the Imperial Irrigation District. It sits in California right down around Yuma. It takes 3.2 million acre feet, or can, about 20% of the river goes into Imperial. It is an important ag growing area. It grows your winter produce. So if you're eating lettuce in the winter, that's probably where it's coming from, either there or Yuma. So it's not, I mean, it's an important area, and one, I mean, it's easy to think that you can come up with, 10% out of them, but over the years, they, I will argue, have done a lot to help solve the river, and this is yet another burden on them. So I talked about how hard it becomes to run this canal as it drops, and this is just pricing. So this is combined water delivery rate, dollars per acre foot here, 150 at the bottom, and then years. And these are—
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Who in California would be making that decision about where?
So, great question. Great question. So there are a number of diverters that use Colorado River water. The most important one is Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. 20 million people in Southern California depend upon this. San Diego, the entire LA area. It's about 30% of their supply. It, unfortunately, has the most junior of all the Colorado River allocations. You would think that they might be the one first stuck with this. I would argue probably not, and that the rest of the diverters are ag diverters in California, and that working with Imperial, which California gets 4.4 million acre feet. Nominally, Metropolitan is about 10% of that. It's 550,000 acre feet. I mentioned Imperial at 320, and then there are a couple other smaller diverters in there. Great question, who decides? California water politics is very complicated. And you bet that's why this is going to be complicated to work out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And so just different pricing levels. So CAP has these charges to deliver water, right? And if you're delivering less water, they still have the same fixed charges they have to pay. And so guess what? That gets put on fewer units of water, and that's why you see these increases as these are shortages, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So in 2019, instead of $175, if you're in a tier 3 shortage, you're almost at $220. That's a huge increase, actually, and that's a problem. These are, so Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan, comparison of Lower Basin versus base case. So base case is, what if you don't do anything? What if we're stuck with these 2007 guidelines? And you get these really bad outcomes here where 10 percentile outcomes, so the worst of the worst, and you can have Lake Mead down at well below 1,000, just not tenable. Here are the 3 shortage levels and these different risk levels. And then here's what happens if you do this new agreement. You don't ever get below, or you just dip down here to 1025. So much better outcomes with regard to the worst case, which water people frankly hate, right? I've not mentioned the Upper Basin much. Just spend a couple minutes on the Upper Basin. So in this state, we've done a study, and this is Powell, January on Powell elevation, less than 3525, which is the elevation at which it begins to have trouble generating power. And frankly, much below this, you actually can't get water out of the reservoir fast enough, because if you can't use the power, the penstocks, you're then stuck with these reservoir outlet tubes, which were never designed to let large amounts of water out of the reservoirs. You can't even get water out of the reservoir fast enough. And what you see here are, these are different hydrologies and different demands, but just 50% chance of Powell getting below 3525, 30% chance. Those are numbers water managers don't like to see at all. And frankly, they did a study with the hydrology happened between 2000 and 2004, the worst of this 15-year drought. It drains Lake Powell. It drains Lake Powell. And so that last slide was on hydrology. It said hydrology here, this is demand. So if you modify the demands, you also, 50%. These are just numbers that scare people. When you get numbers, of really bad things happening in water management above 25%. All right, let me deal with some science. And one of the issues here are Hadley cells, this really generic idea out of climatology that explains why we get trade winds out of the Northeast, in the Northern Hemisphere, why you have the doldrums, and why, frankly, we have these deserts at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. It's where the Hadley cell limb comes down and dries out the area beneath it. And that's why the world's deserts sit here, and you actually can't see it so much in the Southern Hemisphere, but right on the edge of the Hadley cells. And as it warms, these Hadley cells expand. So deserts are marching toward us. So New Mexico and Arizona deserts coming right at us. So some flow projections, the two different modeling outcomes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one called CMIP3, the older CMIP5, and I'll just point you here. These are at Lee's Ferry, and basically for the older modeling runs, you see mid-century, basically about a 9 or 10% median outcome. These newer runs are much wetter, and I'm going to complain about them. They don't show much risk at all, which I actually think one of my issues are these median ensembles, when we have models giving us very disparate results and we average them together and think the median is somehow representative of the future. This is another little pick at some of these models. And so this is an effort that came out of Colorado. Colorado Climate Change in Colorado, what's that thing? CCR, Lucas et al. When you make these model runs, you oftentimes do these downscaled predictions and then run an offline hydrology model rather than taking the information right out of the global climate model. And for a long time, we thought that this more sophisticated approach actually gives us more information. And I'm going to give you a couple slides here that says maybe, maybe not. One thing that goes on, so this is this downscaling technique called BCSD, and the raw GCM output in red. And this is the change in precipitation. You can see these models, run from maybe -10, the red dots, to +10. Well, once you then downscale them to run through offline hydrology models, look how much wetter they get. And what happens is, in the Colorado River, you get model runs of 40 million acre feet a year, when the most we've ever seen is 25 out of the system. And 25 just about blew the system up in 1983 when that happened. I am really skeptical about seeing 40 and 45 million acre feet out of these models. And here's the PDF of it. You can see flow in millions of acre feet. Some of these runs that sit out here, and these two dotted lines are historical ones, either 1906 and 99 or the more recent one, the drought one in blue there. So I just wonder if this latest set of models, we're not fooling ourselves by running these offline simulations that give us really wet outcomes. And in fact, it turns out that when you look in these most recent set of models, half of them can't do the current drought at any point in the 21st century. Half of them can't get that drought. That's got to make you a little bit worried, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. So two really interesting papers just this year, in fact, in the last couple of months. This one by Chris Milley, well-known guy, and basically what he's trying to tell us is that online simulations, these global climate models or Earth simulation models now, because they're an integrated whole, actually do a better job projecting aridity going forward, and that aridity includes runoff. And so these two images, this is basically coming out of the model, which he likes. He says it's consistent and it deals with what's called stomatal closure with plants. So, when plants take in CO2, they also release water vapor. As you get more CO2, that process becomes more efficient. They release less water, they become more efficient. And he claims, and I think he's absolutely right, that when you use offline models and one of the things you always do is calculate potential evapotranspiration, that you overestimate that because you are not dealing with the effects of plants correctly. And these two images, so this is the holistic view he likes. This is the offline version. And in general, this offline version is a lot redder, it's a lot drier. Not always, look here. That's not, but in South Africa, and again, this 30 degrees north and south line that I was talking about with Hadley cells, but note, North America's, southern portion of North America is still a problem, and that includes a good chunk of the Colorado River Basin right there. And this study is really similar from a plant-based, yes?
So, where is most of the water coming from in the basin. So it's not going to be even across elevations, right?
Yeah, it's mostly upper elevation. I want to say, you know, most of it comes above 9,000 feet. Yeah.
So it's really the CO2 effect is relevant. It's happening in those ecosystems.
That's right.
The lower ecosystems that we live in.
You know, that is a really good science question, and to be able to actually look at sort of what's going on with runoff in different elevation bands is something I've wanted to dig into and have not had a chance to do. But nominally, you would focus on these really wet areas, right, and not the lower ones. But it's also possible the lower ones, you know, we've gotten some runoff out of them historically, and now we're getting zip. I don't know.
That CO2 effect. So we see that in our phase experiment in mixed grass prairie.
Yeah.
And it's strong. In fact,
Yeah.
it counters the warming effect pretty completely.
Yeah.
But it really depends on how wet your system is. And as you get wetter and wetter, the effect of CO2 on water use efficiency also goes down. So,
Okay. Yep. Interesting. So this paper gets the same answer and does it in slightly different way. This is Abigail Swan. I don't know her, University of Washington, again, out this year. And basically, she says plant-centric metrics from Earth system models show less drought stress than atmospheric-centric metrics. And she's referring especially to either PDSI as being an atmospheric Palmer Drought Severity Index, or mostly PDSI as being wrong, and P minus E runoff, which is really runoff, precip minus evap, or soil moisture as being better. And this is just the analog to these two diagrams. So look at PDSI, you see this horrible drying almost everywhere if you use these atmospheric-centric metrics. And yet if you use the climate models, you actually get far less drying around the world, but still these same places that we've always been worried about. Anyway, it's interesting, these two papers that came out within a couple months of each other basically are giving us the same answer, and gets back to this question of how good are these offline studies we're doing when you're looking at drought and drying and trying to use some of these standard techniques to qualify that. I mean, here's the IPCC's runoff out of, I think this is the highest emission scenario, 33 models, again, all this drying. Another study that's quite difficult to work your way through that just talks about the drying and what's going on in the Southwest. This comes out of NCAR down in Boulder. Dust on snow. How many people heard of this issue? So quite a few of you. I mean, dirty San Juans, I think that's 2009. Darker snow absorbs more soil, more solar energy, melts sooner. Tom Painter's work. This is dirty snow, lower peak, runs off earlier in the year, about a 5% loss on average. Later studies suggested that if you make this stuff even darker, you get an additional 1% loss, so not much additional loss, but it even melts sooner. So not a 3 weeks advance in timing, but a 6 weeks advance in timing. This is not exactly the area I work in, but how is tree cover going to change in the basin and affect? I mean, Colorado, I think 4 million acres dead due to pine beetles, maybe even more now. This article suggests we haven't had any effect on runoff. This is an Australian article, talks about some interesting effects, and then what happens if we lose all our conifers. Mega drought. Big paper by Toby Alt in the last couple of weeks. You probably saw some of the press on it. We have good historical examples from tree rings of mega droughts occurring in the Colorado River Basin. Here's this period, about a 15% decline for multiple decades. Other cases of drought. Here's where we signed the compact. What is time in the last 450 years? Oops. And the worry is, what's it mean going forward? And Toby Alt and Ben Cook have done a bunch of this work, and basically they say a 90% chance in the American Southwest, or 80% chance. Different papers say different numbers, but huge chances it warms up at getting these really long multi-decadal period of drying in the American Southwest. So here's historic, that chance down around 10%, and here's going forward. These are different metrics, these different bars, soil moisture and some other metrics. And the other thing I guess I would say, and this goes back to my point about these models not getting drought, is Toby's dissertation at a 2012 paper said the models don't get the drought in them right. My numbers I gave you before were the runoff. They didn't get the drought vis-a-vis the runoff. His paper says they're not getting it vis-a-vis the precipitation. All right, so work on a few solutions here, and I'm almost done. So, one of the solutions, the Upper Basin, I don't have a slide for this. Well, there's two parts to the Upper Basin solution, how to deal with this. One of them is empty all the reservoirs in the Upper Basin and run them down to Lake Powell and then hope for snow. That's part of their solution. And then the other solution, at least in this state, there's 4 different states, right? And each state would probably have to have its own solution given water law is state-based. This state's trying to work on a big water bank where we have a lot of what are called pre-compact diverters. So either 1922 or 1929, kind of weird vagaries of the law. Not quite sure which year applies, doesn't really matter. But we have a bunch of ag diverters in the west slope. And the idea is you'd effectively pay them not to divert so that more important uses, that is to say municipal industrial uses on this side of the divide, could divert in lieu. And those pre-compact diverters are, they're like special currency in the compact and they don't get shut off. If we don't make the deliveries out of Powell, at least nominally, we're supposed to cut back until we make those deliveries, hence the scramble in the Upper Basin to figure out what to do about a dropping Powell. So those are the two kind of ideas in the Upper Basin. The one thing I will say is it's becoming increasingly clear that you can't do this water bank idea, this idea you pay these diverters not to divert. You can't do it when you're in crisis. You got to pay them kind of almost continually. You got to be banking water all along. And the issue with that is it's sort of a classic insurance issue. You're going to forego some water to have the insurance. You're going to forego some diversions in water use to have that insurance. And that's a trade-off. How hard do you want to run this system? Do you want to be really sure of having a smaller amount of water, or do you want to really run the system hard and run the risk of going off the cliff? That's a societal question. So, ag is 80% of water use worldwide. That's true in this basin. You can buy and dry lands and put them out of production. There's all kinds of non-permanent things you can do. You can encourage people to switch crops, which is challenging. It's really hard to get them to do that, but you can. Alfalfa, which is about 90% of the water in the Upper Basin. I give a whole talk on this. It goes into, we don't eat it, but it goes into dairy and cheese and meat. That's where a lot of that water's going. Is that a good use of it or not? Society should decide. You can rotationally fallow. There are a few examples of that around the West that have been reasonably effective. You pay a farmer not to grow in some years. That would be sort of an idea behind the water bank. You can deficit irrigate underwater crops, especially alfalfa and hay, which again is most of the Upper Basin crop use. You can do that. And then you can pursue various irrigation efficiency and water conservation measures. But I want to talk just briefly about this. Everybody thinks there's all this water out there, but only more efficient. And in fact, it's not true. And most of the time when you install sprinklers, what happens? Water consumption goes up. It's a little counterintuitive, but let me explain it this way. It's actually pretty simple. When you install sprinklers or drip irrigation, you remove 2 constraints to water use. One's a spatial constraint and one's a time constraint. So the time constraint is flood irrigation, which everybody thinks is wasteful. You have enormous labor to go do it. That's why it gets done once a week oftentimes in growing areas. You got a sprinkler system, you turn a switch. So when your crops get thirsty and you want to water them, you just turn that switch. Oftentimes crops are actually under irrigated with flood. So you move to an irrigation efficiency with sprinklers, you can give your crops full water use. They grow more, they use more water. The other issue is a spatial issue. That's the timing issue, it's a spatial issue. Flood irrigation often over-irrigates a part of the field and under-irrigates another part, both suboptimal. Well, when you put sprinklers in, you irrigate the whole field spatially, very uniformly. Your yields go up. The plants in those fields, in the areas that are underwater, now get plenty of water. They grow more. The plants that were overwatered actually do better oftentimes too. So that is it's a double-edged sword, that irrigation efficiency game. And then finally, the municipal side, systems benefit charge. All of us on our telephone bills, on our cell phone bills, we oftentimes pay into some fund that benefits other people. sort of benefits the greater good, and we don't do that with water bills. You could argue a small systems benefit charge, for example, could go into various forms of ag water conservation that might actually be effective. Municipalities typically conserve about 1% a year, and this is a classic image of Seattle and their demand curves from 1940, actually. So these are all demand estimates that happened, and the black's what really happened over time. Here in the Front Range, I think we're about 20% below where we were in 2000. It continues to drop down. That's obviously a good thing. Municipal water is about 10% of water use in the basin, so it's not huge, but it counts. People talk about weather mod. I'm skeptical whether it really does much. Stormwater capture has gotten a lot of play lately. Direct potable reuse, using markets to try and reallocate. You know, just even diets, meat-based diets use a lot of water. And I've often thought, you know, if somebody could come up with a convincing substitute for meat that many people eat, you would really have something, because you'd have water reductions, you'd have more water for in-stream purposes, you'd have actually maybe healthier people depending on what's actually in this. You really have something, because a lot of this water is going into meat and dairy-based diets. Getting agriculture to flex, and then maybe being a little more sane about water law. Those are all worthy of whole talks. So I'm going to stop. I'm exhausted. Sure.
Could you go back one slide to the irrigation efficiency? I was a little confused by that, Brad.
Yeah.
It sounded like the argument you were making was that if you install sprinklers, then you can more efficiently irrigate all of your land and therefore raise your crop production while using more water.
Yep.
But the question, I think, is if you're given a certain amount of water, a fixed amount of water, then do you get greater efficiency in your crop production?
No, that's a good question. And irrigation efficiency depends on how you use it, right? And I would argue, yeah, sprinklers actually probably are better than flood. There's this whole weird accounting that goes on around water. So flood irrigation, which is commonly used, about 50% of the water you apply to a field actually isn't used. It runs off, either runs off immediately or in terms of delayed return flows. And there's a lot of controversy over these return flows. They do exist. They're real. They're really important. Farmers, especially in the Colorado high country, love to say, hey, it's our return flows that keep water in that river creek in September and October when it would otherwise be really dry. It's our return flows that are 2 or 3 months delayed. The sprinkler thing's interesting, and it depends on how you use it.
So I guess that overlaps with your water law lecture, which is one of the incentives for.
And the problem with Colorado water law around the West is it's never constrained volumetrically. It's constrained on a rate basis. So, I mean, one solution that's been suggested is to say to the farmer, your water right, you know, you get 4 acre-feet for the year. You can do whatever you want with it. You can spend 2 of that on your crops and you can sell 2, but instead they get a headgate diversion amount, which then allows them to fully utilize as much of that as they want. They can grow whatever crops they want to grow. And there are some people now that are saying we probably need to think more about these volumetric limits, annual volumetric limits, and trying to make that water more transferable instead of these very, I would argue, kind of loosey-goosey rate-based amounts that aren't much of a constraint. Yeah.
Let me put you on the spot politically, given especially the slide with your father and uncle and where we are a couple weeks away from an election. It seems like
danger.
I'll try to make it kind of generic.
Yeah.
Every 4 years, I think we have more and more evidence of these concerns, and it's population pressure, but it's a climate signal for sure. And I think every 4 years, I seem to hear less about climate change being in the political discussion.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we're kind of missing something in that as climate change is happening, there's societal impacts that are causing almost the opposite reaction of trying to do something smart about climate change, but rather adding to the animosity, colloquy, or whatever the word would be that that's talking about that's making us less willing to have it be a major issue. I don't know. It's a
So you,
inarticulate question.
yeah. So, well, let me try 30 seconds and I'll give you the floor back. You know, you probably all saw the press pieces on how not one question in all three debates dealt with climate change, right? And I mean, one pushback I saw on it was it's pretty obvious the difference in these candidates. And why do you need a question? I mean, I don't necessarily buy that, but it's pretty obvious there is a big difference here. You know, there's a lot to be encouraged about on the climate change front with regard to international treaties and technology, especially the price of technologies. I've come down, I mean, all these renewable technologies, all of a sudden, they're way cost competitive. And we're losing coal-fired power plant, not, well, in part because of fracking, and natural gas has actually beat out coal. But there's also been this move towards renewables because the prices have come down so much. I don't know, we're winning, but we're not winning fast enough is sort of my answer. I mean, we're not winning nearly fast enough.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, this is a little bit different. You're still on that topic.
No, I have something very different.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking about municipal water use and like Denver, I understand is recently missing some new technology to monitor water pipeline leakage.
Yeah.
It's like more advanced than the existing technology that they have, and it's a lot easier. I'm just wondering, and to your knowledge, is there any monitoring of pipeline or canal leakage, like for agricultural systems across the Colorado River Basin, or any attempt to quantify how much is being lost?
So a lot of these ag systems are 100+ years old, and they have really leaky systems. Now, those return flows end up somewhere, right? Mass is not created or destroyed. It ends up somewhere. Oftentimes, it's lower quality, those return flows, and in large portions of the basin, they pick up salt and selenium. It would be a good thing to get many of these things lined. The question is, how do you pay for it? Because it's expensive. The problem, though, a lot of times there's no incentive. There's zero incentive to kind of monitor and or fix this stuff. I mean, there's real interest in it now, I will tell you. This state, and let me make a pitch for this state. The old phrase, familiarity breeds contempt, everybody knows that, right? So it's really easy to kind of get down on your local scene. This state, based on all the work I've done around the West, it actually has its act together on this issue more than any other state. That's both encouraging and scary. And there actually really are good people in this state trying to figure this out. The problem is there's so much water and it's used everywhere, and it's just hard to get bodies and minds focused on it.
So you showed that, sort of the impact on delivery in Lake Mead as you went down to 1050, 1025. And at one point, you're talking about, it's the delivery part. But it seems to me, thinking about the limnology of that and the water quality issue, as you get lower and lower, you're getting in more sort of degraded water quality. And so when you think about, Las Vegas, even if they're going down to 1025, then they must be doing some treatment on that.
No, this is an issue, right? Because that lake, like all lakes, stratifies, and they want to get water out of that colder layer. They don't want to get it out of that upper layer. And that was part of the driving force to get these intakes as low as possible, not just to be able to draw from the bottom of the reservoir, but to get higher quality water. They're very aware of the water quality issue.
So how much work is being done then looking at the stratification and then the changes in water quality?
I know that the Southern Nevada Water Authority is all over this, and they actually have good reason to. Most diverters, municipal diverters in the U.S., their intake sits above their sewage outflow, right? That's not the case of Las Vegas. They actually deposit their sewage. It's tertiary treated sewage, but it goes into Lake Mead above where their intakes are. Now, it's real high quality stuff, but it's just sort of interesting to think about it. And that's a case actually where they take far more out of the reservoir than they're legally entitled to, but because they get a credit for their sewage inflow that goes in, it then nets out. And it's arguably a reason why you ask them about these, big toilets that waste water and showers in Las Vegas that waste water, almost all of that gets returned back into the lake, and then they get to re-divert it. It's a pumping cost, and it's kind of wasteful. But at least there's a bit of yeah, there's recycling that goes on there.
One idea I've heard about is to, that we're discussing drain Lake Powell first.
Yeah.
So like, is that credible? Is that a credible idea?
So it's been pushed by an entity in Utah called the Glen Canyon Institute for years. It's probably not, I mean, what you could maybe do is drain it. I mean, you're never going to get rid of, I don't think you're ever going to get rid of Lake Powell, just politically. I mean, you could conceivably come up with an arrangement where it made more sense to have water in one reservoir and not two, but I mean, there's a lot of politics. You've got a recreational community on Lake Powell. Page, Arizona is kind of based on Lake Powell, not a huge town, but their whole economy. Is it credible? I don't know. I have a hard time believing it would ever happen, but it's at least worth talking about.
Well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. And I'm sure Brad will hang around for a few minutes to take questions, but I'd like to thank Brad again. Just a reminder, we'll be having our little coffee social at 10:30 on the deck or in the North Central Climate Science Center coffee break area. And then next week we have a pleasure of having Taryn Fennessy here, who's sort of the Colorado climate czar for the state of Colorado, and talking about some of the state plans around climate change. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good job.
Hey, Brad, enjoyed that. You heard it all before.